Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark, and the home of IO Interactive. IOI, of course, is best known for their work depicting our favorite bald-headed hitman, Agent 47. But did you know that during the 6-year gap between Hitman Blood Money and Hitman Absolution, IOI developed 2 games that were so despicable that one of them cost a man his job, and the other earned Square Enix an emotional distress lawsuit in China. Today we will be talking about IOI's other IP, Kane Lynch. I played a lot of the first game when I was younger, and I never touched the sequel, so I was very eager to dig into them. I unfortunately fell into a rabbit hole, turning this simple review into a multi-day film binge as I consumed most of the movies these games pulled from, and then quite a few more. So it's been an interesting few weeks. Kane Lynch Dead Men was developed by IO Interactive and released in 2007 for everything except the Nintendo Wii. It was created using IOI's proprietary Glacier engine, which they have used for all of their games. It's always impressive to me to see a game studio hold on to the same engine for so long, especially these days when everyone is hopping on board the Unreal Engine train. Where Hitman was known for its stealth, preparation, and emphasis on a clean execution, Kane Lynch was a mess of tense shootouts, screw-ups, and unapologetic violence. So why did the studio make such a drastic leap? Working on the same projects can become monotonous, and this was a common trend for developers in the late 90s and early 2000s. You would have teams like Core Design or Insomniac Games who would work on Tomb Raider and Spyro respectively, and they would be expected to pop out sequel after sequel after sequel, and there's only so much room for innovation in that kind of environment. At a certain point, sometimes you just need to try something new. IOI seemed to be inspired by the works of filmmakers like Michael Mann and Quentin Tarantino. Traces of their films could be found everywhere in this game. In fact, Kane Lynch plays more like that Reservoir Dogs game than it does any Hitman games. Kane Lynch has the misfortune of being tied to games for Windows. If you aren't familiar with games for Windows, consider yourself lucky. It's a type of DRM that Microsoft was trying out in the mid-2000s, and it's caused nothing but problems now that it's defunct. There are ways around it, and for most games with a large following, it shouldn't really be an issue. Most people have developed fixes that you more often than not just drop into your game's directory, and it bypasses games for Windows altogether. That's the case here. I also grabbed a mod that increased the FOV. Other than that, I had no problems getting this game started. The gameplay loop in Dead Men is pretty straightforward. You have to go from point A to point B, usually completing a task in between and killing as many enemies as possible. This is a subgenre of the third-person shooter known as a cover shooter. It's called that because, well, you need to take cover a lot. It's in the same vein as games like Max Payne 3, Binary Domain, and of course the father of cover shooters, Gears of War. Now just a note before you type that comment about Kill Switch, don't. I never played it. Please leave me alone. Now this game uses an automatic snapping cover system that just barely works. If you want to take cover behind something, you kind of just walk up to it and hope for the best. Sometimes it feels like it doesn't trigger when I want it to, and other times I find myself sticking to the wall when it's the last place I want to be. The game desperately needed the ability to enter and exit cover with a button press. It doesn't completely kill the experience, but it is such an inconvenience. I've seen people online complain about the bullet spread, and I agreed with them at first. The guns in this game are difficult to control, especially if you're used to aiming in a game like Max Payne 3 or GTA 5. The guns in Kane Lynch are not accurate. It could take an entire magazine to kill someone from a distance. So I kinda just embraced it and started blindly spraying around every piece of cover I could. It actually worked. The game felt a lot better when I let go of the fact that I couldn't one-tap enemies from across the map with a handgun. Honestly, it kinda made me feel like Val Kilmer in Heat. Which was probably intentional, but we'll get into that later. You get access to a lot of different types of weapons here, and you could exchange weapons with NPCs if you want as well. That wasn't a feature I used really at all. Lynch seemed very fond of that shotgun, and I was not going to be the one to come between them. Throughout the game, you start getting access to stronger rifles, but for the most part, any full auto weapon will get the job done. Like I said, just point in the enemy's general direction and hold the trigger down, you'll get them eventually. You also have access to different types of grenades, and nothing is funnier than watching an NPC get launched because of a frag. You also have access to tear gas and smoke grenades, but once again, I just didn't really use them that much. Dead Men has a squad system, where you can give basic orders to the NPCs assisting you, Lynch included. You could tell them to do things like hold their position, follow you, or to attack a specific enemy. I seldom use this system, and it goes away entirely in dog days, so there isn't a lot more to say about it. It can help if you're stuck in cover and need your allies to focus a specific enemy, but aside from that, it could actually be an annoyance. During one level, I must have accidentally told someone to hold their position, and I had to backtrack halfway through the level to find them. If you take too much damage, you get downed, and you have to wait for one of your teammates to pick you up. If you get down too many times in a row, you die. During the down sequence, the game will often replay dialogue from cutscenes, illustrating how Kane's inner thoughts are tormenting him. It's a nice touch. While reviving, you're getting a shot of adrenaline, and if you get too much, you could actually OD. I thought it was a neat way to explain why the character dies if they get down too often, but they actually included this as a story element towards the end. A certain character isn't as strong as the rest of the crew, and getting even more than one shot could be dangerous. It was a neat way to weave a gameplay element into the plot. One small thing about Dead Men that I liked was the way they titled what they call scenes, or chunks of a chapter. Every scene would be named after a piece of dialogue that has either just been said or would be said during the scene. I don't know if this was an intentional homage, but this is also what the Canadian TV show Trailer Park Boys does.
So I'd like to make a request under the People's Freedom of Choices and Voices Act that I be able to smoke and swear in your courtroom. Because if I can't smoke and swear, I'm fucked.
It's one of my favorite bits of the show, so it was neat to see that idea being used here as well. Now, since this was the Xbox 360 era of gaming, there is, of course, a multiplayer mode. It's called Fragile Alliance, and it's an interesting concept. You go into a heist as a team of 8 and need to work together to get out with as much money as possible. However, someone can choose to turn on the crew and take the money for themselves. It's an interesting balance of trust and keeping your eyes on what the other guys are doing. And if you die, you respawn as a cop and have to try to prevent the remaining players from escaping the heist. It's pretty unique, and I remember having a lot of fun with it. I didn't play it for this review because the Games for Windows fix I mentioned earlier forced the game into offline mode. Games for Windows is still finding ways to piss me off from beyond the grave. In Kane Lynch Dead Men, you play as Adam Kane Marcus, a cold and calculated mercenary who finds himself sentenced to death row for the murder of 25 civilians during a botched job in Venezuela. The game opens with Kane's narration, reading a letter that he wrote to his daughter Jenny, explaining the things that he has done and apologizing for the man he's become. For the past few years, Kane has been rising through the ranks of a mercenary group calling themselves the Seven. After the Venezuela job, Kane ran and took the money with him back to the United States. He was apprehended shortly after, but the money was never found. Whether Kane actually believed the rest of the Seven had died or not is up to interpretation, but they are very much alive and they are not letting this go. The Seven hatches a plan to get Kane out so they can force him to hand over the money. The plan involves another death row inmate named Lynch, sentenced for the alleged murder of his wife. During the transport to jail, the truck is rammed and Kane and Lynch are freed by the Seven's henchmen. After an intense shootout with the police, both men are taken to an abandoned shopping mall to meet with the Seven. This is where a lot of the exposition gets laid out, and we find out that the Seven have kidnapped Kane's wife and daughter. Kane believes he knows where the money is, and then we get quickly dropped into a bank robbery. In a scene that feels directly inspired by Michael Mann's Heat, Lynch keeps an eye on the hostages while Kane and an associate breach the vault. Kane reveals that he has the key to the lockbox and only half of the money is there. This is where we get our first taste of Lynch's mental health issues. He's described by a developer as being schizophrenic and insane. I believe this manifests as Lynch hearing voices and having visual hallucinations, as Lynch believes the hostages are police officers and are attacking him, so he starts killing all of them. A fun fact, if you play co-op as Lynch, you could actually see this happening in real time. There are not a lot of levels from this game that stand out, so I want to make a point to discuss the nightclub level. Kane drags Lynch along to meet someone at a nightclub in Tokyo. As dialogue unfolds, you realize that Kane is not going to be welcome here. He takes out a few guards and breaks into a back office to confront a woman named Yoko. Things go south quick as Kane and Lynch kidnap her, then have to shoot their way out of the nightclub in one of the best sequences in this game. This level was inspired by the nightclub shootout in another Michael Mann film, Collateral. From this point on, the game jumps around in various different directions. Lynch finds out that Yoko was the daughter of a powerful Japanese crime lord, Kane gets his wife shot in the face, the duo fly back to Tokyo to kill the Japanese crime lord, and then fly around the rest of the world as if they're not on the FBI's most wanted list. This eventually culminates in a confrontation with the Seven and their inevitable deaths. It's not a complicated game to follow, and it doesn't waste your time with stuff that you don't need to know. I think the game does have some shortcomings, but if you turn your brain off and just play it as an action movie, then it's fine. I mentioned that the series led to someone losing their job. Well, that's sort of accurate. Jeff Gerstmann started working at GameSpot in 1996. He eventually worked his way up to editorial director, a position that's responsible for the content and vision of a publication. In this case, the GameSpot website. When Kane and Lynch Dead Men released in 2007, Gerstmann gave it a fair 6, citing issues he had with the game's AI, weapons, and lack of online co-op. Now at the time, Kane and Lynch publisher, Eidos Interactive, was advertising heavily on GameSpot. After spending large sums of money to plaster Kane and Lynch all over the webpage, they weren't too happy to learn that the game was being received so poorly.
The neatest idea that the game has to offer is its multiplayer mode, which is called Fragile Alliance. It's a really neat idea. Unfortunately, that idea plays out in the context of Kane and Lynch.
When the review went live, Eidos allegedly complained and threatened to pull their advertising funds. This resulted in Jeff being called into several meetings with management and then eventually being terminated a few weeks later. Jeff went on to found Giant Bomb, which became another popular gaming site. In 2012, due to some acquisition jargon that I barely understood, Jeff's NDA with GameSpot was voided and he was allowed to talk about the situation.
This management team buckled basically when faced with having a lot of ad dollars walk out the door.
People say, "Oh, Jeff was fired because of the Kane and Lynch review."
Yeah,
like it was you wrote the review and then you were out the next day.
Yeah,
it just
exactly.
Did not happen like that.
It didn't quite happen like that. I understand why people would say that, and I think that is not necessarily an untrue statement, but there's a lot more to it.
Yeah.
So while it sounds like Kane and Lynch did play a role in the termination, the falling out may have been inevitable if what Jeff is saying here is accurate. You remember how every blockbuster movie in the 2000s needed a tie-in game on the PS2 or GameCube? You couldn't escape it. You would go watch an animated movie in theaters and come home and play the adaptation. Well, a similar phenomenon took place in the latter half of the 2000s with mobile games. Now this was a time before Androids and iPhones, so a lot of these games were super simplistic. You could almost consider them to be Super Nintendo era, 16-bit kind of games. You would be surprised how many AAA releases had an adaptation made for mobile phones. A company named Kilo was tasked with this mobile rendition of Kane and Lynch, a 2D side-scroller with Metroidvania-style platforming and combat. Much like Dead Men, you play as Kane primarily. There are 36 levels broken up into 5 scenarios pulled from the game. The story roughly follows the game, but there are massive creative liberties taken to shorten the runtime. It took me about an hour to play through the whole thing, which isn't bad for a mobile game from 2007. But there is a lot of dialogue between the characters that just feels off, almost like the developers read a summary of Dead Men and just worked off of that. At one point, Kane actually says,
"What the deuce?"
Kane has an automatic handgun that acts as his primary weapon, and it has infinite ammo. It's pretty weak, and as the enemies get tougher, you're going to need something with a bit more firepower. You can pick up 4 additional weapons that consume ammo. Ammo is shared between the weapons, and your ammo amount is the blue bar at the bottom of your screen. You can get a shotgun, MP5, grenade launcher, and an M240 LMG. The only weapon that I really enjoyed using was the MP5. The shotgun and grenade launcher had too much of a delay between pressing fire and the gun actually firing, and the M240 used way too much ammo. I had to play this game on a Java emulator, and I'm not sure if the game was programmed like this or if it was just a bug due to the emulation process, but sometimes the guns would continue to fire after I let go of the fire button. For the primary pistol it was fine, but for guns that devour ammo like the M240, it's just not viable. Lynch acts more as an ability than a playable character. You can switch to Lynch with a button press, and use his sniper rifle to manually aim on the screen. This is useful for hitting switches, taking out cameras, and shooting those pesky snipers, but when you switch to Lynch, Kane goes completely still and rarely defends himself, so you have to be quick. Overall, I would say that this game is fairly broken and hard to play today, but it's neat that it exists, and I'm sure there are some people out there who remember whipping out their Sony Ericsson back in the day and playing some Kane Lynch on the bus or something. So this is for those people. And I can now say that I have beaten every Kane and Lynch game. Yes, even that one. In 2010, IOI followed up Dead Men with the sequel, Kane and Lynch Dog Days, where Dead Men was presented as a neo-noir crime thriller. Dog Days is presented as an ugly handheld-style snuff film. The development team wanted to make something that stood apart from the culture of the time, and so they made the game as ugly as they possibly could. We were lucky that they were required to make a playable video game, because I don't want to imagine what Lynchian nightmare we could have gotten had those restrictions been lifted. Dog Days plays pretty well without having to make any changes, with one small exception. If you have two monitors, for some reason Dog Days will force the other monitor to be a black screen. There is a fix in the form of a secondary application called DXWND that you can download and run parallel with the game to fix that. Dog Days, in comparison to Dead Men, feels a bit more polished on a technical level, while also purposely being made to feel as chaotic as possible. What I mean by that is, it's very obvious that underneath the shaky cam and sudden jump cuts, Dog Days improves almost every flaw of the original, while also playing out like a complete fever dream. The gunplay feels a little better this time around too, with weapons feeling much more powerful. NPCs react horrifically to gunshots, and the environment erupts into dust and debris as soon as the bullets start flying. I was a big fan of the LMG and the ability to just mow down enemies. Fighting someone who has an LMG is a very tense experience, so being able to wield it and have it be equally as devastating was a great feeling. They made the decision to get rid of grenades, and I'm not entirely sure why. There were plenty of instances in this game where I felt like having a grenade would come in handy. And this is no longer a squad-based game. You take control of Lynch this time around, and there is no command system. I think it made sense while playing as Kane and Dead Men, but Lynch doesn't really seem like the leader type, so I guess it works. The cover system has been dramatically improved over Dead Men. You can now choose when to snap into and out of cover. It's a small addition that makes the game feel more in line with its cover shooter competitors. No longer are you waiting for a teammate to pick you up either. When you get downed, you have the option to immediately get back up. If you're near cover, you can also choose to get back up into that cover as well. If you'd rather though, you can just stay on the ground and get a couple of shots off first. This is a much more dynamic approach, and it made for a better experience overall. If you take too much damage while you're downed, you will die though. Now, let me get into some of the weirder stuff about Dog Days. There's an interesting approach to the camera work in this game. Instead of being a traditional third-person camera, the game implies that there is a cameraman following you. It's most noticeable during the cutscenes where there's usually a long, continuous shot instead of regular cutting, and when there is cutting, it feels jumpy and unintentional. But I love weird choices like this, and after reading an interview with the developer of the game, it's clear that they were going for an unorthodox approach, and I think it worked. There were a few things about the camera work that really stuck out to me. When you sprint, the camera shakes and jitters, simulating the cameraman running after you. I wasn't really sure about this when I started the game, but it was a welcome feature by the end. It is yet another aspect of this game that just adds to the immersion. Another thing I liked is something that I'm not even sure was an intentional feature, At the end of the game, you switch back to playing as Kane, and the over-the-shoulder camera starts to move slower, often hiding enemies behind Kane's model, which led to me just blind firing. I think this might have been a bug or something, I'm not entirely sure, but it made for a neat experience regardless. The violence in this game is supposed to be extreme, and the developers tried to make it feel as uncomfortable as possible. Gore is typically pixelated, a decision that makes the game feel unsettling. It's as if you're watching something that you shouldn't be seeing. Somehow imagining what could be behind the pixelation is much worse than seeing it. That is one aspect that I think this game excels in. Even though the gameplay is fun, it can be pretty disturbing at times. Fragile Alliance makes a comeback in Dog Days, along with a few different game modes. Unfortunately, there were only 10 people playing this game at the time that I played it, and I assume they were all playing single player as I wasn't able to find a match. There is an arcade mode that allows you to play through Fragile Alliance maps, with the objective basically being to get as much money as you can. It was alright, but it seemed pretty pointless. I would have rathered some sort of progression system or maybe a roguelite style game mode, just something to keep me playing and give me something to work towards, rather than just a high score. Dog Days takes place around 4 years after the events of the original game. Lynch is now living in Shanghai with his wife Sue, and is still involved somewhat in the criminal underworld. Lynch is working for a man named Glazer, and has set up an arms deal to smuggle guns into Africa. Lynch brings Kane in on the deal as he believes Kane's skill set would be beneficial. Kane agrees and sees the payout as a retirement-worthy amount. Things get messy as Lynch and Kane go to confront someone named Brady at an apartment. It's loosely implied that Brady is an informant. After a short chase and a back alley shootout, Lynch and Kane corner Brady and his girlfriend. Brady uses the girl as a human shield and shoots at the duo, prompting Kane to shoot back, the bullet hitting and killing the girl. Brady looks at her in shock before choosing to end his own life by cutting his throat. The first of many extremely violent displays in this story. Kane has been in Shanghai for about an hour at this point, and has just started probably one of the biggest gang wars the city has ever seen. Kane and Lynch talk with Glazer in his car on the way to the deal when they get ambushed by gangsters. They come to find out that the girl Kane shot was the daughter of some high-profile government official named Shang-Chi. This leads to the duo fighting their way through Shanghai, killing gangsters, cops, and anyone else in their way. Kane and Lynch are truly alone in this city, and it seems like now everyone wants them dead. I have seen people compare Dog Days to a Serbian film, and while I don't really think the two are that similar, I can understand why people would make that comparison, especially after experiencing a certain section of the game. At one point, Kane, Lynch, and Lynch's wife Sue get captured. As revenge for the death of his daughter, Shang-Chi orders that they be tortured. This is shown briefly in the opening scene of the game, where Kane and Lynch are being sliced all over their bodies. What we don't find out until actually encountering this scene later in the game is the men also sexually assault and torture Sue just for being associated with Lynch. If there was any part of this game that wrote the message on a sign and shoved it in your face, it's this section. The violence these men commit has consequences, and often they aren't even the ones affected. I think back to Kane's ex-wife and daughter in Dead Men, whose lives were completely flipped upside down because of the actions of a man they had barely even remembered. And now Lynch's new wife has to atone for the sins of her husband. It's cruel and unfair, but the cycle of violence continues. After Glazer finds out what Kane and Lynch have done, he turns on them and then dies for it. To remind you that you're playing a video game, you then hijack a helicopter and force the pilot to lead an Expendables-level assault on Shang-Chi's tower. Kane believes he can help them escape Shanghai, but Lynch kills him anyway. The finale of the game takes you to an airport, to hopefully find a plane that Glazer had mentioned earlier in the game. Unfortunately, that doesn't work out, and Kane and Lynch decide to hijack a commercial aircraft, and the game just ends. The camera drops to the ground and the end credits roll. The ending is as abrupt and chaotic as the rest of the game, and I loved every second of it. I read in an interview with Ramses Poulsen about the development of Dog Days, and there were a lot of snippets from it that I like. So in this section, instead of just summing it up in my own words, I'm going to read some of the conversation verbatim. In response to a question about whether or not there was pushback about the game's direction, Ramses says, "I would say there was pushback on all levels. It was never up for discussion whether or not we were going to do it, it was a question of how much we were going to do it." He follows that up with, "It's always difficult when you want to make a product that is half art, half commercial entity. But it had to be non-pleasing. How non-pleasing? That's the question. Of course, people are still like, that's the worst game in the world because of the camera shaking, and I'm okay with that. Like I said, it was a chance we took, and I think we felt that by doing something outrageous, there was a better chance at standing out rather than doing something bland." I think those two bits accurately sum up the way I felt about Dog Days. In comparison to Dead Men, like I said before, it was a fever dream. I appreciated the style of Dog Days. I thought it was refreshing to see something so unique and unafraid to take risks, even if those risks led to some people not giving the game a chance. There was a balance of playability and experimentation here that gave me an interesting experience. There was a controversy for Dog Days as well, but I had difficulty finding any actual information on it. Apparently, according to the Japanese website Nihilore, I probably pronounced that wrong, a Chinese lawyer had filed a lawsuit against IO Interactive and Square Enix for the emotional distress Kane Lynch 2 had caused the Chinese people. According to a quote in the article, the lawyer said Dog Days was a Chinese slaughter game. Aside from the Japanese article, and an article on The Escapist sourcing the Japanese article, I'm unable to find any details about this lawsuit, which leads me to believe if it wasn't successful, if it was even real to begin with. Kane Lynch was a series that really surprised me. The memories I had of these characters prior to preparing for this video were cloudy. I remember the gritty action of Dead Men, the unlikable characters, the intense shootouts. I remember Kane being the calm and precise mercenary, and Lynch being out of his fucking mind. What I hadn't remembered though was that beneath the surface, these vehicles for violence and depravity were written very human. They were written with flaws, being filled with regret and remorse. These aren't the greatest games ever made, they're buggy at times, the writing isn't amazing, and the gameplay can be a bit clunky. The anti-violence message of Dog Days is watered down by how fun the violence is. I mean, there's a fucking arcade mode. Dead Men sets out to be a Michael Mann directed video game, and aside from pulling scenes directly from his films, it kind of falls short of achieving that. Despite its flaws though, I rather like Kane Lynch as a series. I appreciate the neo-noir storytelling of Dead Men, and the off-the-wall insanity that is Dog Days. I would say without a doubt in my mind that Dog Days is the better game overall though. There's no question there for me. You could tell the developers enjoyed making these games, and I wish we could have gotten a third entry. Unfortunately, IOI lost the license when they split from Square Enix. The series was supposed to get a film adaptation that never came to fruition. However, in 2010 there was a 6-issue comic book run that fills in a little bit of the gap between the two games. It's a good read, and I rather enjoyed the art direction. Hopefully we see more of the psychopathic duo in the future, but for now it seems like that's all for Kane Lynch. Until next time, thanks for watching.